Good afternoon. Happy Tuesday. We are here again with Matt Grumbling from Nguyen Tarbet. Today is a great day. We are starting our ADA series. So today, Matt is going to talk about the accessibility basics, and that's what the Americans with Disabilities Act means to you. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Julie.
How are you?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm great. Well, this is a new series as you wrapped up copyrights last week. So we're interested to learn more about the ADA.
Awesome. Well, we'll get started here. Yeah, so my name is Matt Grumbling. You can see my full name up there. I've got my cell number up here, and I've got my email. If you happen to email me and don't hear back from me, go ahead and text me. Sometimes things will go to my junk, and it's hard for me to detect that because there's just so much in there. I'm with NTIP Law. That's Nguyen Tarbet LLC. Mostly we do patent and trademark, copyrights, mostly intellectual property. That's what the IP part there is. But today we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to talk about accessibility. I started to become aware of this issue a couple of years ago. We had a client come to us who was in the tech space and was concerned about accessibility on the internet, actually. So I got interested in looking into the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's what the ADA stands for. This is going to be a pretty high level talk. It's not by any means legal advice or legal opinion. It is mostly for education and who knows, maybe a little bit for entertainment value. But if you see anything here that makes you go, feel free to give me a call or drop me an email at that matt@ntiplaw.com. So I'm going to launch in here to this subject, and I'm going to talk about three broad things today. One is to just give you some background on the Americans with Disabilities Act. Then I'm going to talk about what's traditionally been treated under the ADA and what continues to be treated in regulations under the ADA. And then I'm going to talk about what the evolution of the Americans with Disabilities Act is in the internet age. And interestingly enough, this is more an evolution in case law than it is in regulations. So it seems that 30 years after the ADA was passed, we're coming on 30 years. I'd say probably about the 25-year mark. Things really started to heat up in a non-traditional way that where courts started to step in and maybe expand the ADA beyond where it was originally envisioned, although I don't know that it's necessarily an expansion of the black letter of the statute, but it certainly seems to have outstripped it. And you'll see what I mean here. It seems to have outstripped the regulatory agencies in their ability to keep up, ability or willingness or who knows what. But anyhow, let's kind of step into this and talk a little bit about the background. As I mentioned, the ADA was passed in 1990, so it's over 30 years old now, and it was initially an Equal Opportunity Act, or that's its intent. And as an Equal Opportunity Act, it tends to be applied rather broadly. It's known as what's called a remedial statute, and remedial statutes tend to be interpreted by courts broadly. So they're intended to remedy a problem. There's a perceived problem, and that's the reason that Congress passed the law. And as long as it's within the constitutional limits of what Congress and the courts can do, they will seek to extend the law to that extent, and we'll see that as we kind of go along here. It was initially modeled after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1973, and it really hasn't gone through any major revisions since passing in 1990. So it's like I said, it's a remedial statute, and it tends to be interpreted rather broadly. And it protects those who have a disability or have a history or record of disability or are perceived by others as having a disability. And as you can see there, it's kind of past, present, and future, or just in the minds of the beholder. If you're perceived as having a disability, well, guess what? You have a disability under the ADA, or you're at least treated as if you do. That may rub some people the wrong way, but that's the way the law views it. Now, a disability, it has a everything in the law has a definition, or at least they try to define things. You may find that in certain laws, the definition isn't very, very helpful. For instance, in the income tax laws, the definition of income is any income from whatever source derived. You try to tell me what that means. When you define something by its own terms, that leaves you wondering what in the world you're talking about. Anyhow, here a disability is defined as any physical or mental impairment. So now we see at least it has to be an impairment of something mental or physical. And it has to substantially limit one or more major life activities. So now we've got a few more terms in there. There's substantiality. What's substantial? What is a major life activity? What is major in life activities? And normally the way the ADA is defined is these life activities. It has to be more than a transient sort of thing, right? So if you broke your arm and you're in a cast for a while, the ADA probably doesn't help you out much. But if you lost a limb, you're unfortunately with respect to the ADA, you're in better shape because you now have a disability, and you will get some help from the ADA, and we'll see what kind of help that might be. Let me give you some more background. The ADA is actually broken into 4 titles, and we'll cover parts of 2 of them, just parts of 2 of them. The first one we will not cover we'll cover in somewhat is Title I, which covers employment. So this is disability. How do employers have to deal with employees who have some sort of disability? Title II covers public services like state and local governments. We really won't talk about that all that much at all. Title III prohibits discrimination in public accommodations and services operated by private entities. I'm going to kind of lump everything under public accommodations because that's where the lion's share of Title III activity ends up happening. So we'll talk about that. And Title IV covers telecommunications, and we really won't cover that very much because that's our focus is going to be on reasonable accommodations in employment and in public accommodations. The other two, are sort of don't directly affect employers that much, unless you happen to be a state or local official, and then you have to worry about Title II a lot. It turns out a lot of what applies in Title II applies in Title III. It's just the different entities. So you can kind of generalize Title III out and say, well, if you're a public employer, or if you're a public employer, there are other things you need to worry about as well, and you'll learn about those in a different course, presumably. So let's, Title I, it's the EEOC or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has primary responsibility for Title I enforcement. Probably hear about them in the news every once in a while. They handle other things as well. They're not limited just to ADA enforcement. They have a much broader scope, but they get the employment part of the ADA, which is Title I. And the EEOC, like for instance, also shares portions of the Rehabilitation Act with the Department of Labor. So there's a bit of overlap between some of these, some of the responsibilities in the government. That's always fun because you get to watch the different agencies fight with each other over who gets to do what. But usually they play pretty well together. The Department of Justice has primary regulatory and enforcement responsibility for both Title II and Title III. And so you'll see that the standards are very similar between Title II and Title III, largely because the Department of Justice handles both of those. Title IV is managed by the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and that's all telecom. And again, because Titles II and III don't really directly impact entrepreneurs or private employers, I'm not going to talk about them too much. So here's some of the traditional aspects of the ADA. We're used to thinking about the ADA, and maybe hopefully after 30 years, we all think of the ADA in terms of brick and mortar stores and in physical locations, places of public accommodations, and also services that are offered by private citizens or private entities to the public. So these are anything from a doctor's office, dentist office, your local grocery stores, things like that. These all come in. These are kind of covered by the traditional aspects of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Restaurants, any sort of store that opens itself up to the public. And when I say that, I should say I don't actually have this on the slide here, but I should mention it's for well, this is for the public. Okay, so for employment, and I don't have this on the slide, so I wanted to mention this. It's for employers with 15 or more employees. So if you're under that kind of threshold, you don't have to worry about the ADA, which is the federal law. But you may not be completely out of the woods because you still need to look to your state and local regulations for that. But we're just talking about the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act, which is sort of the ground floor that you need to meet. A lot of states actually have adopted disabilities acts that mirror the federal law, to a great degree. But there are outliers that add additional layers, and they probably are not going to continue to be outliers because there are always lobbyists and lobbies for additional legislation. So in terms of employment, the EEOC enforces and promulgates regulations. So the regulations are helpful. They're good guidelines. But remember that it's the governing statute that determines whether it determines whether a person is disabled, and also whether the accommodations you're making are reasonable or not. And I'm going to address this in terms of the regulations, or in terms of requirements and prohibitions. And I'm only doing that for analytical purposes. And I'll tell you why in a minute here. The requirement is that you make reasonable accommodations for a disabled employee. And what that means is, and this is going to be our focus because this is really where accessibility comes in. There are also prohibitions. There's prohibitions against discrimination and harassment. And most of the time, if there's an allegation of lack of reasonable accommodations, it will come in the form of either a complaint to the EEOC or in a lawsuit, where the charge will be that the employer didn't make reasonable accommodations. So even though I have the prohibition down, I have discrimination under prohibitions, know that reasonable accommodations is actually something that pops up there as well. So what do we mean by a reasonable accommodation? Well, it's an adjustment of work conditions, and this presumes that there's kind of a norm for work conditions for a particular job title or job position. So you start off with that norm, and then you adjust the work conditions to allow an employee, a disabled employee, to apply for work, do the work, or enjoy the benefits of work. And there are three aspects there, right? So one way you can imagine discriminating against people, whether wittingly or unwittingly, who have disabilities is simply don't advertise the work or don't allow a means of application for the work that is accessible to the individual who you might want to exclude. So just to take a brick and mortar example, suppose that you had everything in your company is accessible except the HR office where you go to drop off your applications, and that has a staircase that's quite steep and is not accessible to wheelchairs. Well, that might be one way to keep out people who need a wheelchair to get around. You just keep them from turning in their work application at that location. I don't know that that's ever happened. I also can't say it's never happened. It wouldn't surprise me if it had, quite frankly. But then, okay, as the person's applied, let's say they get hired, well, they still need to have reasonable accommodations to do the work. I think that's where most of us would think of, kind of the obvious place where you need to have accommodations to just do the work. But then there's also enjoy the benefits of work. What if one of the benefits of work is that we have a monthly party and we celebrate birthdays and everybody gets to come and eat cake and have fun and whatnot, and there's nothing accessible there for the person who is, has a disability. So you have to think kind of broadly about these things. It's not just doing the work, that's just making the workstation accessible. It's kind of the whole kit and caboodle. Or if there's a lavatory on premises, and it may be a requirement for the local, just to have an occupancy of a building, that there be a bathroom available. Okay, well, it has to be accessible, and I'm not going to go into depth about what that means right now, but you need to think about those things. And this is the kind of the traditional thing. After 30 years, I think most employers probably know about this stuff. It doesn't have to be the accommodation that the employee requests, as long as it's a reasonable accommodation. It's objectively reasonable, not subjectively reasonable in the views of the employee, but reasonably, from a third party objective standpoint. Undue hardship to an employer is a defense. And keep in mind, we're talking about employers of 15 or more employees, but if it would be too difficult or too expensive for the employer to reasonably make these accommodations, then that's a defense to a charge of lack of reasonable accommodations. So some of the factors that need to be considered here are the size of the employer. An employer who employs 5,000 is going to be judged by a completely different standard than one that employs 50 or 25 or 10. Well, 10 is going to be outside the ADA, won't it? The financial resources, a really heavily capitalized employer is going to be judged far differently than a startup. And then also the needs of the business. Let's be honest, there's some job functions that cannot be reasonably accommodated for disabled persons. if I'm acting distracted, it's because my dog just entered the room and he's coming over asking for attention, and I'm ignoring him. So here are some examples of reasonable accommodations, and these are just a few examples. If you, let's say, either in the application process or in the job itself, in the work environment itself, you might need to have alternate formats of presenting information. So if the disability is impaired eyesight, you might, if it's just impaired eyesight, maybe a bigger fonts. If it's if the individual is blind, then you might need a screen reader, and it might need to be audible or braille. Those are both options there. If you have impaired hearing, then you need visual representation of audible content. If you have there are physical accessibility accommodations, there's parking, elevators, perhaps service animals. If, again, it depends on the work environment and the needs of the business, but service animals might be called for, equipment changes, adjusting a workstation, let's say to accommodate a wheelchair or something like that, a reorganization or reassignment. So, if possible, to say just reorganize workflow so that, a disabled person concentrates on things that person can concentrate on, and maybe the work that isn't so easy for him or her to do would be apportioned to somebody else. Again, it has to be reasonable. So if it's not reasonable and it's judged by an objective standard, so you need to keep that in mind. Public accommodate. Let's talk about Title III, public accommodations. The Department of Justice oversees both Title II and Title III, and they passed they promulgated rules. Initially, I believe it was there was an earlier iteration of the standards for accessible design. Those have been superseded by the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. These are helpful guidelines for helping those who, say, run brick and mortar restaurants and stores and whatnot that are open to the public. They have also promulgated, Department of Justice has also promulgated a guidance. It's called the Guidance on the 2010 Standards, and it kind of explains the standards. So the standards are set forth in very technical terms, probably more understandable to a contractor, and then the guidance actually provides a little bit more meat to that, and would be more helpful perhaps for somebody who's not in the contracting business. You can see these on ada.gov, kind of a helpfully short URL. So this applies to construction and alterations made after March 15, 2012. So, you can, this is 9 years after that. So, or nearly 9 years after that, chances are, if you're doing a new build or if you're building out a space that you've taken over from somebody else, but you're doing a remodel on it to make it fit your needs, you need to look at these ADA standards, and hopefully your contractor is looking at them and living up to those standards and whatever higher bar your state and local laws may require. And it provides scoping and technical requirements for construction and alterations. I'm not going to go into detail on what those are. I'm going to hit them, I think, in a later presentation. But right now, you just need to know that they're there. And I think it's helpful to look at them if you happen to have that kind of store. I'll mention later on, I'm actually going to do a whole presentation on audits. It's not a bad idea to do your own self-audit, even even before you open your doors, but even after you open your doors, every once in a while to go around and just sort of do a self audit. Is my place really accessible? And by a place, I mean a public accommodation. If it's your private home or something like that, that's different. But we're talking about here about public accommodations. And I'll give you a few examples of standards or guidelines. It covers parking. What's the maximum grade in your parking lot? And it's actually, the standard is 2%. So, that's 2 feet over 100 feet or 2 inches over 100 inches. And the reason for that is if you happen to be in a wheelchair or you're somebody who uses a walking assist device, it's hard to make it up a grade that's steeper than about 2%. There are standards for ingress and egress. There has to, the ingress, being, in entrance and exit of the building. Restrooms are a huge place where brick and mortar stores and restaurants get hit for violations. Seating, and not just the amount of seating, but the quality of the seating. Is it wheelchair accessible? Is it accessible to those who have limited mobility? Services, things like that. So one of the surprising things to me, there were two surprising things to me. I never really thought about applying the ADA to the internet, number one. And number two, I had never really considered the fact that if it did apply to the internet, that the regulatory agency that is overseeing that application wouldn't put out regulations. Well, they haven't, surprisingly, and perhaps they should, but I don't know that they've given any indications they're going to very soon. So, but that doesn't mean, just because there's an absence of regulations doesn't mean the law doesn't apply to you. And in fact, we'll see as we go through this that the courts have kind of filled in the gaps that the regulatory agencies have left. So we'll talk a little bit about this. So as I mentioned, the Department of Justice has not issued rules or guidance for internet accessibility. Maybe someday they will. I personally hope they will, but they haven't yet. And I'm just reminding you that the DOJ is the governmental agency that's tasked under the ADA with issuing rules and enforcing Title III. Well, very helpfully or not, depending on your point of view, the courts have stepped in and they filled in that gap with what's known as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And these are published by a non-governmental agency known as the World Wide Web Consortium. And if you go and you look at the WCAG or the WCAG, and you look them over, you'll find out that that they're actually even stricter than the guideline, than the sort of brick and mortar style regulations that DOJ has put out. And they're also subject to change by an agency that is not appointed by any executive here in the United States. It's not authorized by Congress. It is simply in some ways, it's almost an ad hoc group of people who are interested in accessibility, and they've put out these guidelines. You might even wonder about the constitutionality of that kind of thing, but so far nobody's really challenged that, or nobody's challenged it and won. And just as a bit of advice, my general advice is you don't really want to be the test case for those situations. It sounds really kind of romantic to have a case going up to the Supreme Court, but it's awfully expensive, and you probably don't want to be that case. So, unfortunately, in the internet age, it behooves us to be aware of what this W3C is putting out in the WCAG. And then my next bullet point is, and you always have to be aware of state laws. I know, for instance, California has some consumer protection laws that go above and beyond what the ADA has, and they may affect you if you're selling to California residents. It would be awfully awkward for you to put up a website that said, well, we sell to everybody but the people in California. So, and in fact, there's a question whether that would be even, legal. So let's talk about, under this this worldwide web consortium, who do you need to worry about in terms of, who's a disabled person? And here's the thing, it says anyone with a disability that can be accommodated with reasonably available technology. And if you're aware of what's been going on in the internet and most people have at least some awareness, certainly entrepreneurs do, you understand that available technology is an evolving thing. Changes from, boy, it seems like it changes from minute to minute. I have a phone that's one generation behind the one that my wife just bought, and she has so much more capability than I do, and her battery lasts longer. And so the question is, which of those is reasonably available? The more expensive, more recent one, or the one that I carry in my pocket that does just fine for 99.5% of what I do? Is 99.5% enough? And so you can see this is a moving target, and something that honestly, you probably don't know, and I certainly don't know everything that needs to be known in terms of what's reasonably available technology. So it probably would behoove you, if you're developing a website, to hire somebody who is not only skilled in that area in terms of the technology and the marketing aspects of it, but also understands what these accessibility guidelines are, because they can get tricky. It can be the disability can be any sort of auditory, cognitive, neurological, physical, speech, or visual impairments. And I have visual sort of highlighted there because it seems like most of the litigation against internet-based solutions over the past maybe 5 years or so have been lodged by people with vision impairments who get on a website and find that their text reader is unable to interface properly with that website. And they don't just file their own personal lawsuit. They will file a class action, naming themselves and some undetermined number of additional plaintiffs against the defendant, who, in some of these cases, you'd be amazed at the size of these defendants and, and their sophistication. You're surprised that this goes on. So let me give you a little bit of, and so as I go through these examples, you're going to see that whereas the ADA itself protects people who have more or less permanent conditions, the WCAG are broader than that. They actually cover things like a temporary loss of a hand. So if they want you to be able to use your device one-handed. Say I've got my phone here, and I want to use it. Well, you need to be able to select an accessibility option that will allow you to use it one-handed. Most of those you can, but what about my computer at home, my laptop? Can I use that with one hand? Well, there needs to be an accessibility option if one is reasonably available that will accommodate that. If I have no limited or poor eyesight, so that there's a spectrum there. like no eyesight, well, you need to actually have a reader that either reads it out in Braille or in some accessible auditory way. Poor eyesight, well, maybe you just need to have fonts that change, and you can, most websites you can, anything written in HTML normally you can do some sort of a function that will expand the font so that you can see it well. Those fonts have to be adaptable to that, and so you need to have your website constructed in such a way to be accessible. Color blindness. Have you thought about color blindness? I'm not sure that I do, but there may be situations in which that can be something that you need to accommodate for. Okay, let's say instead of loss of eyesight, you have a loss of hearing or operation in a loud environment. And both of those, the solution might be either some sort of captioning or some some text equivalent to the available in real time, so that that can be seen. Or maybe if you're doing a WebEx or something like that, you might need to have an interpreter, an ASL interpreter. So here's an example, and this is a lawsuit that was filed. I don't know how it's turned out, but so a really large provider of podcasts was sued because of course podcasts are mostly audible. They didn't provide the same content in transcripts or subtitles or synchronized sign language video or something, and I'm not sure what the reasonable accommodation would have been there, but they got sued by people who have impaired hearing because their podcasts weren't accessible. Websites, they tend to get hit because they are not accessible with screen reading software. And that's amazing to me because some of these websites are operated by rather large providers, and yet I don't know the details of this, right? So I'm not weighing in on either side of this. I'm just showing you that the kinds of things that pop up and the kinds of issues that arise. And then, like if you might have noticed if you watch some videos and some hosting fora that there will be captions available or captions on photos or subtitles or things like that. So that's about all I have for this week. We will delve into some of these things more deeply in the coming weeks, but the main takeaway for today is that the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to both brick and mortar public accommodations as well as on the internet. And whether it should or shouldn't, whether it's within the scope of what Congress originally intended or not, that may be debatable. But the way the courts are treating it right now, you're better off. You're certainly better off making, and you think about it. The W3C, World Wide Web Consortium, published their initial WCAG in order to give people guidance on how to make their websites accessible to, in order to expand their user base. So even though it's now being used in a way that seems to be punitive, it's also an opportunity to service a wider range of customers. And so if you view it that way, then you see it as not so much as an expense, as something that it's an additional expense. It's certainly easier to make something accessible from the get-go rather than to have to go back and fix it after you've been served with a lawsuit for lack of accessibility. So I hope I've at least sparked some interest here and given you something more to keep you up at night. Anyhow, that's all I have for today, Julie. I'm going to hand things back over to you.
Great, thank you. Sorry, my video was not working properly. Can you?
Yeah, I see you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That was great. If anybody has any questions or you want to refer this this webinar, or you'd like to watch it again if you missed something and just go over it, it is recorded. All the webinars are recorded, and you can find them on YouTube on the City of Surprise Economic Development channel. And next week, we will be back with...
I don't know off the top of my head.
I do. Next week, we will be back here with accessibility offline. So how the ADA affects your brick and mortar.
Gotcha.
So this is actually going to be a great series, and I'm excited to learn more about this because this pertains to every business and everybody. So thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you.
And I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next week.
Yep. See you.
Thank